Kia ora everybody, and welcome back to Civilization 6. My name is JumboPixel, and today I've got something rather special for you. I'm going to cover my full review of Civ 6. Now, I won't dwell too much at the beginning of the video because we have a lot to go through, but just a couple of notes. I have reviewed both the New Frontier Pass and done a Civilization 5 vs Civilization 6 comparison before. So if you'd like a deep dive on the DLC for this game, or how Civ 6 compares to Civ 5, I'd recommend you check out those videos in the description and maybe even on screen. Anyway, without any further ado, here is my full review of Sid Meier's Civilization 6. I'm recording this review in 2021, so that's 5 years since Civilization 6 first came out. During that time, we've also seen a myriad of DLC content. 3 main releases. We had Rise and Fall, then we had Gathering Storm, and finally, just recently, we had the New Frontier Pass. Rise and Fall has largely been replaced by Gathering Storm, which is fundamentally the core DLC that I recommend to most players, and the New Frontier Pass added a whole raft of new game modes and civilizations to Civ 6, and really fleshed out the entire game. I argue more recently that the New Frontier Pass adds an incredible depth of value to the game, and I do recommend it to any players who are sinking a lot of time into Civ 6, or who have gotten bored of the initial offerings of the title. Anyway, that's where Civ 6 is at right now, and as far as we've been told by the developers, the April 2021 update was the final free update. Some speculation around whether that is the final free update for the New Frontier Pass or for the overall game, but I think it's fair to say, now that we are comfortably 5 years into this game's life cycle, and remembering that Civ 5 had a life cycle of around 6 years, we're probably, if not at the very end of Civ 6's offerings, at least very close. Before I move on to actual gameplay features, the other thing I would like to address is, of course, price and platform. Again, I covered this in one of my previous buyer's guide videos, but Civ 6, now having been out for 5 years, is a very cheap title. The developers often do free access weekends on either Steam or Epic Games, sometimes both. So keep an eye out for that if you haven't picked it up already. You can play it for free. Generally, you can pick up the game itself for a 75% discount, and most of the DLC, with the exception of the New Frontier Pass, goes at least half price. And I imagine we'll see the New Frontier Pass move towards that half price, or indeed 75% off price point very soon, at some point in 2021. And I'd recommend you pick that up then if you can. Now let's talk Civilization 6 itself. We've got a fully fledged experience in front of us now. We know exactly what this game offers. Let's reflect on it. What did it do well? What new features did it introduce? What does it not do well? And my final thoughts on the game. So, first up, key new features to Civilization 6. First one I'm going to cover is graphics and performance, because I think this underpins the rest of the game, right? You are literally staring at this board probably for hours and hours and hours, and that's just for one playthrough. So how it looks and how it performs really matters. I've spent most of my time playing on PC, so I won't delve into the specifics on console in this video. But it is, of course, available on almost every platform under the sun at this point, so it's a very accessible game. And it performs very well too. This shouldn't surprise anybody. It's not particularly graphically intensive, particularly on PC. And of course, it's a 5-year-old game, so we would expect it to perform well. Its graphics, however, are an entirely different kettle of fish. When Civilization 6 first came out, I'll be the first to admit I didn't particularly like the game, I didn't particularly like the graphics, and I didn't particularly play it very much. So I have definitely come a long way in my learnings with Civ 6 and in my feelings about Civ 6. And one area where that has changed is graphics. I would probably summarize Civ 6's graphics in 3 words: controversial, colourful, and cartoony. Mainly for the same reason, right? All 3 of those things are down to the same reason. It is the fact that these graphics are different. Very different from the graphics of old. The Civilization franchise has always held itself to a certain level of realism over its competitors. We'll ignore Beyond Earth. Um, Shout out if you know what that is. But when Civ 6 came out, it introduced a very different art style, right? These graphics are cartoony. They are more colourful. And that led to them being quite controversial. I have to say, while I do still prefer, personally, the art style of Civilization 5, the more realistic, slightly grittier, slightly less showy, right? It's got less mod cons. It's simple. It's to the point. I do believe that the art style in Civ 6 is probably something that we'll see moving forward. It's a very popular color palette and art style if we think about new releases and games that are releasing in 2021, like Humankind. And I think we'll see it moving forward. I actually also have warmed to it quite a lot. I think that because you're staring at the board for so long, it doesn't actually hurt to have it a little more colorful and a little bit more playful. Yes, it's a very serious game. Yes, it's still grounded in history. And none of that changes when we have a slightly cartoonier art style. Anyway, I'm not here to convince you it's good. I'm just here to review it, reflect on it, and evaluate it. And that's where I stand. The next feature I'd like to discuss, and this really changed the way that we play Civ, is the urban sprawl through districts. The district mechanic fundamentally changed Civilization 6 from previous franchises and makes Civ 6 a very unique game. So, in previous franchises and in other 4X titles, you have your city, you plop it down, it's on a tile, that's it. You build buildings within it, it changes the way it looks, but fundamentally, that's all it does. In Civilization 6, the game introduced urban sprawl. Now we have a district which takes up just as much room on the map as a city tile itself for science. It's the campus, right? We also have one for production, we have one for faith, we have one for governance, we have one for connecting our city to fresh water, that's the aqueduct, we have preserves, we have all kinds of unique and specialty districts. A city can easily have 10 of these districts at its full peak. What that means is the game itself has changed fundamentally, right? Fundamentally, it is an entirely different game. It requires more specialization within cities because your districts are limited by your population, they're limited by your geography, and of course your production or your gold or however you're making them. So you do have to make choices. There is an opportunity cost involved with building cities and planning districts. I like that. I like that limitation that it adds. I like the fact that it causes you to think ahead. It causes you to plan differently. They all have different adjacency bonuses. They all have different preferred geographical locations. They have different resources they'd like to be next to, or different other districts that they'd like to be next to. So it adds a real specialization and complexity to the planning. And I believe that's a strength. I believe that helps us separate average players from great players, or poor players from average players. It adds a learning curve to the game, which is good because we want this to be an experience that we can spend hundreds of hours in and not be bored at the end of it. It adds, I also argue, a real depth to replayability, because no two playthroughs are the same, even with the same civilization. Your geography and your cities and your neighbors can really impact the way that you build and plan your cities, and I think that's a good thing. I will, of course, admit, there are downsides to it. The learning curve, while great for players who are willing to stick some time in and play the game to its max and really delve in hundreds or if not thousands of hours, it does make it more difficult for new players, and the in-game tutorials aren't particularly helpful to ease players through it. So that is the one main downside, I would say, is that this complexity also makes it really challenging and potentially frustrating for players who don't fully understand it or who aren't interested in micromanaging their empire to that level, right? If you're not a SimCity player, you might not be interested in building a SimCity, so to speak. Of course, it's very different. It's a very different scale, very different game. But fundamentally, I do think that criticism of the districts really does apply. Next up, I'm going to talk about the science and culture trees, because these are the two things that fundamentally determine your success in a game, right? You need to tick up your science to get new technologies and buildings and so on and so forth. You need to fuel the war stick. But also, there's a really strong argument that culture is just as important, right? It ultimately fuels all of those things that science does. Civilization 6 took a different approach from previous games. We have a tree for both. We have a scientific tech tree, like we've seen in previous iterations of the game, but now we also have a cultural tech tree, so to speak, or, of course, a cultural civics tree, as it were. It helps, I think, players understand that the two concepts progress in very similar ways, so that it was nice to see them streamlined, and I think that worked well. I also think the introduction of the Eureka system worked incredibly well in both the science and cultural tech trees. For those not familiar, completing a certain task within the game enables you to research that culture or civic twice as fast. It's called a Eureka bonus. For example, if you have built 3 arches, then you achieve a Eureka for the next tech beyond arches, right? If you build a water mill, the technology that allows you to build an aqueduct, engineering, receives a Eureka. There's a logic to these Eureka bonuses. They're not just random. They are planned, and they're really aligned with real-world logic and a real-world history. It makes sense that if we've built a water mill and learned how to harness the power of rivers and water flow, that we would be better, broadly speaking, at engineering, particularly with things like aqueducts, right? It makes sense. It makes sense if you get a kill with a slinger that you'll be better at making archers, because you are investing in that technology. I think these Eurekas were incredibly underrated in the beginning of the game, and I think that as players have adapted, we've learned, we've developed, and I think we really like them now. The only downside and criticism that I would draw on them is that it can, of course, lead to sort of a pigeonholing of technologies. A sort of, you're stuck in the rut. You have to get the Eureka. If you're min-maxing, particularly if you're playing at harder difficulties, it does narrow your focus a little bit. And so I would say that while they offer a really interesting and dynamic way to understand technologies and to relate them to the real world, it can lead to a little bit of pigeonholing and sequencing that not all players will enjoy. The next thing I'd like to say, my third sort of main point for this review, is to acknowledge the level of replayability that Civilization 6 offers. I'm talking specifically about the full experience here, or at least the experience with Gathering Storm and or the New Frontier Pass. We have a wider cast of leaders and civilizations than we've ever seen before in this game. Not only in terms of gender of leaders, we have multiple leaders from the same civilization. We have civilizations from many different areas of the world that we haven't seen before. I'm going to give a local shout out to Kupe of the Maori Empire. The first time I've been able to play as a Kiwi, as New Zealand in Civ 6, and that's really cool. And we've seen that across a lot of other areas as well, particularly in areas that may have received less focus than before, right? Areas of the world that the game devs haven't touched have been touched, and that's great to see. The downside that I would draw here, particularly on leaders and civs, is that we do still see a very Eurocentric game. Lots of European civs. And if you've seen my video on a couple of Civ 6 experiments that I've done playing a true Earth start in a European country or within the European continent, you can see that, the game still very much favors European leaders. Maybe we would expect that, because of who the devs are targeting, who they are, where they've come from, target market for the game. But it would be nice to see a little more diversity still, I think, in the leadership lineup. On the wider cast and sort of wider experience, I would also add that, and I'm particularly focusing on the New Frontier Pass here, but it does apply to the wider game, the wide expanse of game modes that we have now. We've got barbarian clans, we've got secret societies, we've got monopolies and corporations, you name it. There is a heckload of replayability in Civ 6, and that is one of its strengths, and I have no downside to draw from that. That is just a pure strength. This is a really polished experience now in 2021, a very polished experience, and it's come a very long way from the title that was introduced to us in 2016. And even after Rise and Fall as well, the game was still quite flawed. But the title that we've got now, the base game, which has been refined and tweaked a lot, particularly in terms of leaders and balancing, but also the broader DLC package, it's really, really strong. Really, really strong. So massive shout out to the Civ 6 team for producing a really solid product. I think that probably draws my key reflections, evaluations, and conclusions of Civ 6 into what is hopefully one neat package for you. As I said at the start of the video, I have covered Civ 5 vs Civ 6, Civ buyer's guides, and also a in-depth review of the full New Frontier Pass already, so do check out those videos below if you want to try and get a more broader picture of my insights into the Civilization franchise, one which I've spent a lot of time playing, and I don't regret it for an instant. I am still, believe it or not, a Civ 5 fan over Civ 6, but I have to say, over the course of Civ 6's development cycle, of its release cycle, and having put more time into the game now than I ever have before, I can comfortably conclude the Civilization 6 review by saying that my initial knee-jerk, slightly emotive reactions to Civ 6 when it first came out 5 years ago have changed. I have moved from someone who did not like this game to someone who really enjoys this game, and I really value Civilization 6 as a solid, fundamental entry into the franchise. I think it has ballooned and blossomed into a wonderful addition, and I take no qualm in recommending Civilization 6 to players who love city builders, strategies, 4Xs, real-time strategy, you name it. I have no qualms or issues in recommending Civilization 6 with the Gathering Storm DLC, Civilization 6 with all of the DLC, or even the standalone game at a free or cheap access weekend to any players interested in this kind of game, or of course, history more broadly. This is a historical game, and it follows history very closely. Thank you so much for watching this longer form review of Civilization 6. This has been my full review. If you enjoyed it, I would really appreciate a like rating, and as I say, there's lots of follow-up related videos available in the description and on my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and please do share your thoughts on Civ 6. I know this can be a bit controversial, and I'm sure we'll hear lots of opinions in the comments, but I do love to hear them, so please do share. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.